an enemy once they took our hostages in 1979. But I want to remember Shahab Fatheazam, who was born in Iran, is here to put present concerns into context. He'll talk a little bit about the history of the country where he was born. Shahab has lived in the United States since 1973, and his successful Wall Street career began at Kidder Peabody, where he's a cross-border investment banker. He earned an MBA from Columbia in New York, and he also earned a degree in history from Cambridge. And you may have heard of one of his fellow classmates at Cambridge. His name is King Charles. We are also happy you chose to be with us today and that you rejected the invitation to go to Buckingham Palace to be with His Majesty. Anyway, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you all for being here. I was told David is a very, very serious taskmaster, and he told me to keep it within 50 minutes. And it was a little difficult getting 4,000 years of history into 50 minutes, but I'll give it a shot. The purpose of this talk here is not a lecture, and it's not a talk about Iran per se, but as you'll see towards the end of it, it's really to put everything in context, so that when you hear Iran in the news and things going on, and there's going to be a lot more going on in Iran in the next year or two, in my opinion, at least you'll have a little bit of context. When I was in Wall Street, I used to give talks to a lot of European CFOs and stuff, and in one of the lectures I gave, at the end of the speech, one of the ladies came up to me and gesticulating like that, said, "I found your speech extremely superfluous." So she said, "Can I have it in writing?" And I said, after that sort of introduction, I may consider doing it posthumously. And she looked at me and said, "I can't wait." So, at the risk of being superfluous, I'll take a little bit of your time this afternoon. I told Julie to idiot-proof this presentation, but there. So, I don't know when it was, but I came here once. Marina Carney gave a talk about her father and where he came from. So it was a very sweet, wonderful presentation, and I'll never forget it. I can never match that, but I wanted to start this talk talking a little bit about my family. This gentleman is my great-great-great-great-grandfather. His name is Fatheazam Shah. He was the Shah of Persia. It's not an exclusive club being related to him because apparently he sired 1,000 children. So, so when I went to propose to Melody, this is how I looked. She said, "I'll marry you as long as you lose the beard and the skirt." But more about him later. Persia, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, time adjusted, is the largest empire the world has ever known. And this is a map of one period in Persian history. It stretched from India all the way to Greece and a bit of Africa and Egypt, etc. And this empire had a monotheistic religion called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was very influential in ancient days, and we somehow still have some of the effects of it in our lives today. For example, the early Romans adopted some of the sects of Zoroastrianism, and they followed some of the precepts. And they for example, celebrated a big Persian celebration on the 25th of December, which was the shortest day of the year, and it's still celebrated in Iran. And so the early Christians also gravitated towards that date, and sort of that date has continued, etc. So that was one sort of element of Persian influence. The other one was until 1500. Very few people know this, but until 1500, Europe celebrated the Persian New Year. And the Persian New Year, which was the Zoroastrian New Year, starts in the spring equinox, March 21st. And Pope Gregory changed that calendar to the Gregorian calendar, which we all use today. And so New Year and so on changed. But until then, New Year was the Persian New Year, which was March 21. Evidence of that, there are 4 months in the calendar which have numerical names. September was 7, and October was 8, November was 9, December came from Deca, which is 10, that leaves 2 more months. So you can tell that sort of the 12 months was also sort of impacting the Persians on Rome. So this was basically the ancient Persian day and sort of the ancient Persian Empire, and we'll skip around it again. There's a lot to talk about. But one of the most famous kings of ancient Persia, there's a reason I mentioned this in this talk, considering what's going on in Iran today. But the first recorded piece of a tablet or written recording of human rights on Earth was this cylinder called the Cyrus cylinder, and Cyrus the Great. And a copy of this is in the United Nations in the General Assembly Hall as the first record of human rights. So the Persians, unlike what you see today, were actually among the earliest to celebrate human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of gathering, and all the rest. All of this is in cuneiform in this tablet of Cyrus the Great. And basically, he's still buried in Iran. That's his tomb, and it's in central Iran. It's not far from Persepolis, which is the old capital of Persia, but that's the tomb of Cyrus the Great. So Iran, a lot of people think because it's in the Middle East, Iran is the land of deserts. If you check Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia, 20% of Iran is desert. And if you check the United States, the lower 48, 30% of the lower 48 is a desert. So Iran actually has smaller deserts than the United States. Very few people realize that. They assume because it's near all the Arab countries, it's all a desert country. But these are 2 samples of Iran. Iran is very similar to Colorado, the weather and the topography and so on. Great skiing in Iran. And I just wanted you to have a quick look at that and see what that looks. The size of the country, by the way, is equal to the United States east of the Mississippi. So it's a pretty vast country. And Iran has its Vermont, Iran has its Florida, so it's a pretty vast country. Okay, so let's keep going on this. So I mentioned some of the sort of careful, if you're not careful, you'll see some Persian influences in the language. And these are some examples of common usage words in English that all are Persian. And there are others as well, because Persian is an Indo-European language. And again, these are all relevant to what we'll talk about later, when we talk about the context of Iran and where it's heading and so on and so forth. But the language of the Persians is Indo-European. It has more in common with Italian, French, German, and English than it does with other languages in Asia. And so also the pronunciation of many of the words that are in the European language is very similar to German, and the relevance of that will come a bit later, a bit later as well. So I know a lot of you in this room like jewelry, and it's very important in countries that are old monarchies. One way to gauge the importance of their country is to compare their jewelry, crown jewels. Which country do you think has the most valuable crown jewels? Anybody take a guess? So I checked Britain, for example, the British royal family went on Wikipedia, and the value of the British crown jewels is $2 billion. And the value of the Persian crown jewels, which fortunately are still intact, mysteriously, miraculously, is 20 billion. It's worth 10 times that of Britain. Both Britain and Persia stole a lot of these jewelries from India. So the source was closer to Iran, and I guess the Persians stole more than the British. So this is housed in the central bank. The central bank was built in the late 30s, and it was built sponsored by an architect that copied the Federal Reserve Building in Washington. So I don't have a picture of that building, but in the basement of that building, in a safe which is area-wise the size of this room, these jewels are housed, and there's some spectacular jewels in them. The thing that I remember from my visit when I was a child is that jeweled globe that you see. That globe is this big. It looks very small. It looks like a lapel pin, but it's this big, and it's a really spectacular thing. But these are some of the jewels that. And this jewel is so valuable that the jewelry in Iran backed its currency when the Shah was alive. So this was the Fort Knox of Persia, and this thing on the left is the peacock throne, which was again stolen from India by the Persians. And the Shah of Iran, who had his coronation, the 2,500-year celebration of monarchy in Iran, when he had the coronation in the 70s, he sat on that peacock throne that's all bejeweled and so on and so forth. So, moving on from the Persian past a little bit, I thought it would be very interesting for you to see how far back the knowledge of Persia and the United States came together. The first knowledge of Persia really was brought over by the Puritans because they were biblical, they were very religious. The three magi came from Persia, so that's the first time that the interest in Persia began in the colonies when they started settling here. And then Cyrus the Great was also in the Bible. And again, it was another cause for people to be interested in Persia and so on and so forth. But the thing that really made Persia interesting to the early settlers and the founding fathers was Constantinople was taken over by the Turks in the 15th century. And the Turks were Muslims, and they became the bad guys among all the Europeans. And the Europeans settled in the United States. So they brought with them hatred of the Turks. But they kept saying, compared to the Turks, the Persians are wonderful people, because they didn't do this. And so they always had a very high view of Persia and compared it to the Turks and so on and so forth. And the earliest travel book in Persia was a British travel book from the 18th century, which talks about this. The Turks are not comparable to the Persians at all. So that was interesting. So Persophilia developed in the colonies. And both libraries of Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin had a lot of Persian books in them, books about Persia, I should say, in their book collections. And Ben Franklin was known to have praised ancient Persians for the value they placed on education and virtue, which is what I tell my friends all the time. It doesn't work anymore. But as far back as 1761, Persian carpets were advertised in Boston. And as early as 1785, Harvard began its first lessons in the Persian language. So the knowledge of Persia and so on goes back quite a bit. In a very positive way, the view of Persia and the United States goes back that far. And this is a copy of an alphabet book of early settlers in the United States. And the X is Xerxes. And it says Xerxes the Great did die, and so must you and I. But the X was Xerxes, which was one of the kings of Persia. But this book was, is an evidence of how much they knew about Persia. And I would hazard a guess and say that young early settlers in the U.S., in America, would probably know more about Persian kings than if you call a 10-year-old somewhere in the United States today. So the other interesting thing is, this is the U.S. Post Office building in New York. And the reason I have it here is that if you look, this building was built in 1912. And on the top of it is written, neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stops these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. So this is in New York at the post office. That description is of the postal service of ancient Persia by Herodotus, the Greek historian. So he was describing, so Persia was the first country that developed the postal service, and is described in the General Post Office building in New York, which is very interesting. So it's still there, obviously. So let's go to some other dates connecting the United States' early connections with the US and Persia. In 1807, a South Carolinian diplomat who was going to Russia on various missions decided to go south and step foot in Persia. And he was the first American on record to have visited Persia, 1807. And Joel Poinsett is the guy who's also a botanist. And just a little tidbit is the poinsettia flower was named after him, actually. So this was the first record of a U.S. Visitor to Iran. And then the missionaries started to come. And the first Americans missionaries were Justin and Charlotte Perkins. They arrived in Persia in 1833. They established a boys' school, and that tradition stayed on for up to until the revolution of 1979. In fact, Melody went to the Presbyterian school in Tehran when she was a school child in Iran. So these things have persisted. I don't know if they're still around, I doubt it. But anyway, so this missionary journey started from a very early stage in 1833 onwards, and then continued. So when was the first U.S. ambassador named to Iran? The first U.S. ambassador was named to Iran by President Chester Arthur in 1882. So he came to Iran and was the first inkling of American interest in the area, but it really precipitated a bit later, which we'll get into. What about the other way around? Well, in 1903 is the first record of 1903 Persians in Chicago. These were immigrants who came from Persia to Chicago as early as 1903. And they looked pretty well dressed and all that, but anyway. So this was the earliest picture of Persians who came to America as immigrants. So it goes back a long way. So why this interest in Persia? Why did it all develop? In 1908, an Australian by the name of William Darcy was rummaging around in the area looking for oil. First, he went to Azerbaijan and he was walking on the beach, and every time his footsteps made an indentation on the beach, it filled with black water. So he got a little suspicious of what's going on, and then he went to the south of Persia and struck his first oil well in 1908. And of course, there was a great deal of excitement and so on, and he made what is today known as BP, was the first company that had concessions to that. And Churchill, who was the vice lord of the Admiralty in 1912, had the brilliant idea to change the Royal Navy from coal to oil. And so he changed the entire Navy from coal to oil. And this decision, this one decision of Churchill, changed the Middle East for good. It was never ever the same. And so the United States started beginning to take notice after World War I in the area as a strategically important part of the world, and so the interest began to grow. So let me, before I tell you who this is, let me give you a little bit about what was going on in Persia at the time. Persia, until the 1920s, was ruled by an extremely weak, pathetic dynasty by the name of Qajars, the Qajar dynasty. And they drove the country to bankruptcy and so on. Part of the reason was they were under the thumb of the mullahs who took over Persia, as you know, later on. And the mullahs liked to have a country that's backward, they could dominate it, they could suck its wealth and so on and so forth. So the king of Iran was very weak at the time, and it was under this influence of two great powers, Russia to the north and Persia and Britain to the south. The British wanted the south for two reasons. They wanted to block Russians from having access to warm water, and they also wanted free access to India, which was the prize of their colonies. So they wanted the south, and the Russians wanted, kept the north. So Iran was a pathetic state, and there was a gentleman, very clever gentleman, like Napoleon, in France. He was the head of the Cossack regiment in Persia. His name was Reza, and this is him. And Reza became Shah around 1920, and I'll describe it to him. But things that were happening in Iran at the time were very interesting, because in 1906, when he was in the Cossack regiment, Iran had a constitutional convention. And Iranians decided that Iran should be a constitutional monarchy, 1906. And in the constitution they drafted, they gave women freedom, complete freedom, to vote, to have property, and all the rest of it. I just want to remind you that the suffragette movement led to the 19th Amendment, which was dated 1920. So the Persians were talking about these things, and of course the mullahs, this was anathema to them. So they quashed that and so on, so the chaos continued. So Reza Shah took over the country, got rid of the Qajars, and decided that he'll start a new dynasty called the Pahlavi dynasty. And he was the father of the Shah, but you know, that was part of the revolution and so on, and had to leave the country. So Reza Shah had to deal with a couple of things. He wanted to modernize Iran. He took the mullahs by their beards, told them, you stay in your lane, you don't come out of it. I'm going to modernize the country. He built schools for girls. He built a lot of educational establishments. He built the first railroad in Iran and all the rest of it. But one of the things that was happening, he was under the thumb of the Russians and the British. And this was a bit of a problem for him. He was looking for a third power that he could get close to sort of balanced that a little bit. So who did he turn to? It was Adolf Hitler. So before World War II started, it was not an ideological reason he gravitated towards the Germans. It was really to counterbalance the Russians and the British. And the German scientists were also feeling this from the other side. And they kept saying to him that we and you are Aryans, Persians and Germans. The Aryan race started in Central Asia, and one branch went to Iran, and one branch went to Europe, and we're cousins, and all the rest of it. So he changed the name of Persia in 1935 to Iran. Iran means land of the Aryans. But it's really not ideological, and it had nothing to do with what Hitler did, but it was really balancing the two big powers. So when they started to win the war, they got very fed up with him, both the Russians and the British, and they told FDR that it's really time to get rid of him and put his son in power. So, as you know, FDR went to Tehran. There was a conference between Stalin, Churchill, and FDR in Tehran after the war to decide how to divide and conquer and so on and so forth. And but they had decided to exile him, and he was exiled to South Africa, and they put his son in power. And his son, basically, Mohammed Reza Shah, was very, very young when he was invited to take over as king. And here he is in that coronation which I mentioned on the peacock throne much later. But Mohammed Reza Shah, which was the Shah of Iran, developed very good relations with every American president in his lifetime. And starting with FDR, who's not in this picture, I don't know if he's in the next, no, he's not. But he was a little offended by FDR because FDR was very imperious, as you know, and he was in Tehran and he didn't have time for this pipsqueak king. But he just put in power. He didn't want to see the Shah and didn't have time for him. But somehow the Shah managed to take 5 minutes of his time, so he didn't manage to beat FDR. But among these groups of presidents, the pattern that emerged is that Democratic presidents had a problem with the Shah, and Republican presidents had a very good relationship with him. Generally, that was the case. Under Kennedy, for example, they had on the surface very good relations and so on and so forth, but Kennedy was very much into developing democracy in Iran and human rights and stuff like that, and they sort of mocked the Shah a little bit, and so on and so forth. Johnson was the same, but the closest relationship that the Shah had with American presidents was with Richard Nixon, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the Shah was a very sort of a fine dandy and brilliant in his geopolitics, and he could handle everyone, but he led a very glamorous life. He married 3 times. His first wife was the daughter of the king of Egypt. It was an arranged marriage to unite Egypt and Iran at the time. And so this was his first wife. He had 1 daughter from her. That daughter is still alive. And but she couldn't stand being in Tehran because Cairo was much more. Cairo had an opera and a stock exchange. Cairo was a much more vibrant European city than Tehran was at that time. So she got very bored and left, and the 2 of them had to get a divorce. So his next wife was Princess Raya, who was an absolute beauty, and the Shah loved her, and she loved the Shah very much. I will never forget, Melody and I were skiing in Sun Valley many years ago, and one of us had some fever or something. We went to see a doctor, and he was a very nice gentleman, elderly gentleman. He came into the room and he found that we were originally Persian. He said, "Oh, I had to handle her ankle. She sprained her ankle, and holding her ankle in my hands, I will never forget that. So it's a very, very funny thing. So the reason they divorced is that she couldn't bear any children. So very difficult for them. They had a divorce, and she loved him and he loved her, but for the sake of the continuity of the dynasty, he had to change wives. So they got divorced, and he instructed one of his ambassadors, close advisors, to go on the lookout for a wife. And they found an architectural student in Paris who was multilingual, very bright, athletic. The Shah was a very athletic guy. And so they introduced the two of them and they hit it off, and she eventually became the third and final king. She's still alive. She splits her time between Paris and Maryland. But she became his third wife and bore him 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And the eldest son is still alive, and we'll talk about him later as to what he's up to. So I mentioned the Shah and Nixon and how close they were. This was very, very interesting because the roots of the Iranian Revolution was set up here. The Shah and Nixon became very close friends, and the Shah was the biggest buyer of US arms at the time, which is very helpful to Nixon. And Nixon always said, if you want to control the Middle East, you need to have Iran as a friend. And he was absolutely right. He read it right. And the two of them were very close. And when the Shah died, as you know, he died a very lonely man. One of the few ex-heads of state who went to his funeral was Richard Nixon, who flew all the way to Cairo. And so they were very, very close. But this book really goes over their relationship and so on. The jets that he bought, the Phantom jets, were very much advanced at the time. Those jets are still functioning in Iran because Iran was boycotted by everyone. The US didn't sell the arms. So the few Air Force planes that they have in Iran are still from this period, old and full of holes. So why did the mullahs come to power? The mullahs basically, the Shah's reign, I mean, if you look at the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, it wasn't because people were poor and destitute. Both these revolutions occurred when industrialization began in these countries, where people were beginning to get wealthy and so on, and they wanted more. They wanted more freedom and more power and so on. That's what caused those revolutions. Under the Shah's reign, Iran really developed industrially extremely fast. It was one of the most powerful economies in the world at the time. They lent Britain $1 billion because Britain had a balance of payments problem and so on. The problem the Shah had was, on the one hand, it was developing very rapidly on the industrial side, but then on the political side, he was very repressive. And he got rid of every political party around, every opposition was gone, and basically he created 2 parties. And the Persians joke and say the 2 parties were called the Yes Party and the Maybe Party. So these are just for play at the end, those 2 parties created. So the only institution that had any form of institution left in it under the Shah was the church, was the mullahs, was the mosque. So one reason why Persian Revolution ended up the way it did with the mullahs is that the Shah had killed every kind of opposition, and he was very much against the constitutional monarchy, which was his biggest mistake. And so he had cancer, he was dying, and you know the story. But the Ayatollahs took over in 1979. When they took over, Iran was very wealthy. It had the highest natural gas reserves in the world, had the 4th largest uranium reserves in the world. It was a very, very rich industrial country at the time. And about 7 tumans, which was the Iranian currency at the time, 7 tumans was $1 when the mullahs took over. It's now 500,000 tumans to $1. So inflation is like the Weimar Republic during before World War II. That's how bad things are in Iran today. So I would say this is the autumn of the reign of the mullahs. I think this can happen tomorrow morning. It can happen a year from now. But this is heading that way. As Hemingway said, the two ways to describe bankruptcy, gradually and then suddenly. And so I don't know when the suddenly will appear, but that's what's happening. So you all saw the women in Iran, just like the United States, women in Iran are superior to the men. And so the women of Iran have taken the challenge of opposing the mullahs. Very repressive group of people. They have no problem killing oppositions in the streets and so on and so forth. So the women of Iran have finally won their freedom. I think the democracy that they're craving for in Iran has been started by the women of Iran. Because if you go to Tehran today, you'll see no women with a veil, with a headscarf, and they won that war. The mullahs just couldn't handle it anymore and said, okay, fine, you can show your hair. And so they got these little victories, and it all came from the women of Iran. But the country is destitute. Iran is destitute today. And so it's a cauldron about to explode. We don't know how it's going to happen. Outside forces, like Israel and the United States bombing and so on and so forth, have a limited effect on regime change because they also create some antagonism towards foreign powers and so on. But this will happen. They're very corrupt. Their kids are all out of the country. And so, and the head of the mullahs, the supreme leader as they call him, he's 86, not in good health, and so he won't live forever. And upon his death, there's going to be tremendous chaos among the priests themselves, vying for power, and that will weaken them, in my opinion. The problem is that there's a very strong military force in Iran, which is taken over from the mullahs and runs the country, and 80% of its economy is under their rule, and so on and so forth. So what happens when Khamenei, this guy who now is this chief mullah, dies? There's several outcomes which can happen. Any one of them can happen. So one of them is a Putin-like regime may emerge. The problem with that strategy is there's no Putin in Iran today. So, unless he comes out of a dark building somewhere, I don't think that model is going to work. The Chinese model is an interesting one. China, as you know, is a communist country, but under Deng Xiaoping, I think, they decided to open it up to capitalist system. So they have their communism and they have their capitalism, and that model may be adopted by the Iranians. So we shall see. The third option is a military dictatorship. Out of that governing body, the military, there may be a strongman that emerges that will take over the country and so on. And the final option is the young Shah, which I mentioned earlier. This is a picture of the son of the second Pahlavi king. So he lives in Washington, and he is very interested in setting up a constitutional monarchy in Iran. And he's making those claims, and he has some followings, but the followings are not that deep-rooted. So I wouldn't necessarily bet on that option necessarily taking over. But whichever option takes over, this is a country that's very educated. It's like 90% educated. Very bright people. They're not going to stand for anything short of democracy. So that's a given. That will happen in Iran. And so in terms of looking forward, that should be in the back of everybody's mind, dealing with the mullahs. But one of Shakespeare's plays, Antony and Cleopatra. There are two of the aides to Antony and Cleopatra and Caesar were talking. And one of them told Antony's right-hand man, your boss is getting old and there's no power left in him and so on and so forth. And Enobarbus says something very interesting to him. He said, you know, an old dying lion has one final scratching thing left in it. And so that's what's happening in Iran with the mullahs. They have, you know, just they're sort of desperately trying to show that they're relevant. Iran has no control over its skies. Iran is very weak today. I told you the state of its economy, and 70% of its population, 92 million, are under 30. These people are not going to go to mosques and follow these 86-year-old mullahs. So there are going to be a lot of interesting changes. It's an important country, so we should be ready for it. And I just hope that some of this may have left you with a little bit of a better understanding of Iran, its past, and so on and so forth, so that as the next chapters take place, we at least have a little better understanding of what this country is all about. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions, because I'd like this to be interactive, and we'll take it from there. I'll just mention two things. One is this author who just wrote a book wrote this line, which I think is very important. Collapse of the Iranian monarchy brought an abrupt end to one of the most important economic and military alliances the US had established anywhere in the world, which is true. And the final quote is from my favorite president, Ronald Reagan, who said this: the Iranian Revolution is a fact of history, but between American, Iranian, and Iranian national interests, there need to be no permanent conflict. So that's how we'll end it, and see if there are any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I guess on the subject of the sort of youth culture and sort of women's development in Iran, I'm wondering what role you think the murder of Masa Amini and the responding protest had for forwarding that in developing those.
Yeah, I mean, the question I was told to repeat it for people who were, yeah. So the question was, what role did the murder of Mahsa Amini, the young Kurdish girl, have on some? It had a big role because it was a catalyst. It was the match that lit the gasoline. But the hatred of the mullahs was there. I've heard from people who go back and forth, unfortunately, Melody and I can't do that, but people who go back and forth have told me that cabs don't stop for mullahs in the streets. So that's how much people hate them. I've been told that many of them have shaved their beards, they're dressing in normal clothes, they've sent their families abroad, they've stolen a lot of money, and so that's what's going on. But Massa was that catalyst. You're right.
Shahab, you can't visit or haven't been able to since.
No, yeah, so definitely since 79. Melody and I belong to the Baha'i religion. The Baha'i religion is hated by the mullahs. Why is it hated? The Baha'is stand for equality of men and women. The Baha'is stand for education for everyone, equality of science and religion, the elimination of priests, all the things that are anathema. So they view Baha'is as a third column, in Iran. So they're persecuted. So that's one reason. And then there were other reasons we can't go back. But I left when I was very young. Melody left later. I had to get rid of that skirt. Melody left later, and we went to New York to study and so on. So we cannot go back. David,
That was similar to what I was.
yeah, no, so we have to rely on others who are back and forth and so. Yeah,
For Shahab, how many signs did you have that it happened? Very sad.
before he fell, what were the signs?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The question is, before he fell, were there any signs that a revolution was about to happen? There were a lot of signs. Melody and I went to a dinner in New York for the Queen, Fatheazam, and Nelson Rockefeller was her host, and so on and so forth. And during that dinner, suddenly a young person stood up, and this was security was very harsh and so on and so forth, very tight. In the middle of her speech, somebody got up and started screaming down in the show and so on and so on, and he was dragged away. The Queen continued with her speech. 2 minutes later, somebody else got up from the room. And so a lot of that stuff was going on, which was one sign that there's a lot of discontent in the country. And you know, not dissimilar to the issues today that you hear in the party that, you know, affordability, you know, it's one of the catchphrases of the election now. Iran had an affordability problem as well. It was a land of very rich people, middle classes were struggling, and the poor, and so on and so forth. So the Iranian Revolution was also a social one. You know, the people who supported the mullahs, the people we see in the streets, stomping on American flags and stuff, they're really from very impoverished areas. They're paid $5 to come to these things. And that revolution was also a social one, because they saw all the wealth in the country and so on and so forth. So there were signs. One of the Shah's generals told him, give me the signal. In fact, Nixon was giving him the same advice. Why don't you send your army, you have one of the biggest armies, why don't you go and just get rid of these demonstrations and so on and so forth. And the general said, we'll mow them down, just give us the order. And Shah said, how can I kill my own people? I'd rather leave. So he also sort of humbled a little bit in terms of putting up with that, the changes, opposition. So I've taken it, yeah. Oh, sorry.
What is the education of the people today?
So Iran is a very well-educated country. And so that's why one of the issues is they're talking about, let's bomb the nuclear facilities and that's going to end it. They'll end the facility, but the knowledge is there. That's the problem. Iran is very well-educated. And it's no mystery that since 2003, 2 Nobel laureates came from Iran. Both of them were women. In fact, Rob Lansing, and I had dinner with one of them. She came to Chicago, we had a dinner with her. They were both women and both from Iran. So it's very, very educated. Most of them are girls. Most of the graduates of the universities are 56% are women, professionals, doctors, architects, so on and so forth. And so very well educated. Very, yeah. And that's one of the problems the monarchs have, because they thrive on illiteracy and so on. It just doesn't work.
I'm interested in, whenever I meet people from such as yourself and others, I think of the same class, obviously. They insist on being called Persians as opposed to Iranian. What's the dividing line there? Are there people that insist on being Iranian? Others insist on being Persian? That's a vast thing.
It's a great question. Iranians were very embarrassed during the hostage crisis. And they found various means and ways to hide their identity, especially those who lived in this country. One of them was, say, we're Persians, not Iranians, thinking that somehow people Yeah, so I think the hostage crisis precipitated this Iran-Persia. The second thing is there's an emergent pride in Iran's past because of the filth that they've seen recently. So they want to go back to days that Iran had some grandeur and so on and so forth. So that's also one reason they see Persia more than Iran. Persia is a nice name, but Iran is. Yeah. So land of the Aryans. Yeah. David?
Are there any more questions? If not, thank you for a fascinating presentation. And will you be around for a few minutes if people want to talk with you privately? Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. That was a lot of great insights. Learned quite a bit, and thank you so much.
Well, it's nice to meet
They want to put it down.
Yeah. So most of them are, actually one of most of my friends I did on yes, November. Yeah.
So.
You're opening up.
On a man.
Oh my goodness, that's my husband. Is he about 74?
It is a small.
I thought he was so. Is he still? The last I saw. Okay. But he had a phone, still alive. Yeah.
I'm loaded.
He died when he was 30.
We agreed that we're gonna have dinner. And either they have to have to to our house and then we're gonna.
We'll do that before Christmas.
Okay. Which is good.
When it's something. I'm sorry? No, I was telling him he was coming. Okay, come on. Yeah.
Yes, the mom's dying. I'll just invite myself. Oh my God.
No, we should have kept going. We could have kept going. He went to. Yeah, I did hear about it. No one else would be interested. I would know more. I got married in the store. No, not, no, it was just come out. Yeah, yeah. Very good. Okay, you will see It's really very TikTok. Thank you, that was very interesting.
Good to see you. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Nice to see you.
She's ready. She's ready.
Lather some butter on it.
Yeah. What's it? Yeah.
We have so many questions that, Larry and
I have this, slide.
you know,
Questions are coming.
so many other questions I have about the religious aspects of society and, you know, where they fit in society, whether it's Sunni or Shia or Baha'i, Christian, and how that relates with political situations. It's got huge aspects. Right. Yeah, that's all societal evolution.
Different name.
It's like, you can't just walk into a place and say, well, this is now a democracy, and we're going to expect there's no institution. There's no culture. So that takes generation.
I'd like to see her mom.
Yes.
Is she around?
She took off back.
I said hello to her.
Came up. So I had some questions. I said, here or at home? She said, at home. I took them all. She's tough. Oh, yeah. We're lucky to have her. I knew it was coming. That's the right thing to do at the beginning. Just bam. Hit it right at the start.
We have a family. Yeah. Yeah. When I first met them. Oh, yeah. I don't ever just see the Shahab dog. I know. Yes, and she, it was just, there's no. Speak for in between, yes. Your family still there? Right, yeah. Did you keep Mel's there? Yeah,
She's a lot like her. Well, she thought, I saw.
Oh, of course I realized it. Somebody really said that to you about your speech, that it was the most superfluous thing to be done. I was gonna say, that was hilarious. Well, I really enjoyed it. It's great. Good to see you.
Oh, so then he's in that store. Yeah, and then. She forgot that picture, and I was the coordinator. And so he's so amazed. And he gave his mom the rest of the thing. So she said, and if you ever want to learn, I said, you know, it's a good time. Yeah. Wait, you got guys. If you can send me the out, easily.
Where did I see that?
Great. 2009, maybe 2009. Like, I was like, okay, go and
The other
¿Qué cosa? Para que se vayan a quemar. Y aviso de que ya se vayan a quemar. Cuando están platicando. ¿De qué?
Everybody.